of Fairmont Jaipur. So allow me to welcome two powerful ladies in the house, Barkha Dutt and Christina Lamb, over to the stage, please. So we had our first day, which was quite power-packed. I just wanted to show you the glimpse of how first day went on, and then maybe two beautiful ladies will take it on from there. Can we have the video, please?
A very good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Well, as Sir has already introduced, that we have two powerful ladies in the house with me on the dais. But, you know, I'm going to introduce to you a reporter of considerable stretch and depth. She is passionate and she is fearless in bringing the issues closer to her viewers. She is Emmy-nominated reporter, author, contributing columnist and editor, and she is none other than Padma Shri Barkha Dutt In. May I have a big round of applause for her? And today we have with us Christina Lamb, who is a British journalist and author. She is the chief foreign correspondent for the Sunday Times. Christina has won 14 major awards, including 4 British Press Awards and the European Prix Berks Calvados for war correspondence. She is an honorary fellow of University College Oxford, a fellow of the Royal Geographical Society, and a global fellow for the Wilson Center for International Affairs in Washington, D.C. Ladies and gentlemen, put your hands together for Christina Lamb. We welcome both of you. It's really a pleasure having you here with us. May I request Christina to kindly take the session forward? Thank you. Ma'am, the mic is not working. You can have my mic.
Can you hear me at the back? You can hear me at the back, right? Okay. So it's a pleasure to be here and an absolute pleasure to be in conversation with Christina, somebody whose work I have admired immensely. Some of our experiences overlap as reporters who cover war and conflict, though of course Christina has much more experience and accomplishments than I do, and I hope to learn a lot from her in this conversation. I want to start by asking you something that everybody here always asks me. What is it that makes you cover conflict? What is it that makes us go to war to cover a war? What is that thing? Are we different? Are we danger junkies? Is it an inner calling? Is there something that you have to have innately to be a conflict reporter as different from a political journalist or a business journalist?
Well, in my case, I never set out to be a war correspondent. Actually, I wanted to be a novelist. And I thought if I went and worked as a foreign correspondent for a bit, I'd have some adventures and something to write about. But actually, what happened was when I left university, I worked at the Financial Times in London as an intern in the summer. And I was absolutely fascinated by India. I traveled here as a student. I was desperate to one day be Delhi correspondent.
Where did you travel here? Which part did you go to?
I spent a summer coming to Rajasthan. I went to Kashmir, I took a train from Delhi to Calcutta, stopping at various places. And I was completely intrigued and fascinated by it. And so my dream was to go to Delhi. So then I worked as an intern at the Financial Times, and one day the foreign editor was supposed to go to a lunch of South Asian politicians, and last minute he couldn't go, and he said to me, "You're always going on about India, why don't you go to this lunch?" So I went instead of the foreign editor, and I sat next to somebody who was Secretary General of the Pakistan People's Party, which was Benazir Bhutto's party. And he said to me, "Would you like to interview Benazir?" Because at that time she was living in exile in London. This was in the 1980s. So, of course, I said yes, I'd love to. So he arranged for me to go and interview her. And the day that I went to interview her was the day that she announced her engagement to Asif Ali Zardari. So her flat was absolutely full of bouquets of flowers. I'd never seen so many flowers. And we got on very well. She was very good at charming foreign correspondents. I think, as you probably know, at that time she couldn't be written about in the Pakistani media because of censorship. So she relied a lot on foreign media. Anyway, she then went back to Pakistan. I got a job in TV, actually, in a local television station in Birmingham in England. And I was the most junior person, and it was an area that had a lot of motorways, so we had a lot of accidents, and my job was mostly to go to the parents of young people who'd been killed in motorway crashes and ask for photographs of them, which is the worst job in journalism, I think. And so one day I came home from work, and there on my doormat was the most beautiful gold engraved invitation, which was to Benazir's wedding. So of course I went, and it was my first visit to Pakistan. It was an incredible introduction. It was a really colourful wedding, went on for a week. But also because she invited me not really as a journalist, but as a friend, I got to go to all the sort of more intimate things with her close friends and family. And also every evening after all the celebrations, there would be discussions with all her political colleagues about how to topple General Zia. So, for me, I'd grown up in London. The most difficult thing I'd ever had to do was sort of find my way home late at night if I'd missed the last train. And suddenly I was meeting people who had been tortured, tear-gassed, arrested, all to try and restore democracy to their country, which was something I'd always taken for granted. So I just thought, I can't imagine going back and covering local news in Birmingham. And in fact, the last story I ever did for Central TV in Birmingham was a man who turned his car back to front, so it looked like it was going forwards when it was going backwards.
Yeah. Well, it's kind of ironic when I listen to you talking about Zia and Benazir and the tussle between the military and the democracy, because that's actually exactly what's going on in Pakistan right now. And we'll get to that, but I want to talk a little bit about your personal experiences covering war, covering conflict. You have written a very, very moving and goosebumpy piece about almost dying when you were embedded with the British troops in Afghanistan. Give me a sense, we ask soldiers these questions. What do you tell yourself at that moment when the image of your family flashes through your mind? How do you knock that image out and focus on that battle? But what does a journalist tell herself? Because you do write about how at that moment you could see your son's face in your, and that was the face that flashed through your head. So what does a conflict reporter tell herself, and what makes people like you and me go back again and again and again? Like, are we just crazy people?
Probably if you asked my husband, he said I was crazy.
He's here somewhere, so we will, yeah.
Well, I think, there is an element of addiction to it in that, you're living on the edge and seeing people in these really difficult situations. is really fascinating, and it can be quite hard to come back from. But sure, I mean, in that particular occasion, this was in 2006 in Helmand in southern Afghanistan, and I was with the British troops. And actually, to be honest, the most dangerous things I've been in have almost always been where it wasn't supposed to be dangerous. So this is one of the problems, I think. And we'd actually gone on a patrol to a village. It was supposed to be hearts and minds and sort of going to the village and asking what development they needed. And it's interesting because I don't know about you, but I think when you've done this job for a long time, you develop kind of antennae and you know when a situation's not right.
Yeah.
And there are certain signs. And actually when we got to the village, there were no children around, and kids always appear in Afghan villages and ask you for candy, and so that was very weird. And then also there were very few elders around, and actually I said to the commander of the British troops, I think this is odd that there are not many elders. So he asked, and they said, oh no, they're at the mosque praying. In fact, later we realized it wasn't prayer time. So we sat with them and had this discussion about what was needed in their village. And again, Afghans are the most hospitable people on earth, and they didn't offer us tea. So that was also strange. And so at the end,
everyone in the subcontinent will offer you tea, even if they have nothing else in their home.
Absolutely. Yeah. So at the end of the discussion, the main elder said to us, if you go out of the village that way, instead of the other way that we'd come in, you'll find that there's a bridge over the canal, and we'd had to jump coming, and I'd actually fallen in the canal, much to the amusement of the soldiers. So we went the way he said, and I had my notebook out. The commander was saying to me, well, I think that went well, didn't it? And literally, as he said that, the first shots rang out, and so we stopped. And I was with about 45 soldiers, and 15 of the soldiers had stayed outside of the village with the vehicles and the big guns, and they were on a ridge about a mile away, and so they'd been ambushed. So we stopped to try and understand what was happening, and within a minute we were under fire as well, and then everybody ran and jumped into all these irrigation ditches. And actually, I dropped my notebook as I jumped in the ditch, and in 27 years of being a foreign correspondent, I had never lost a notebook. I've lost many other things, but not a notebook. So I started climbing back up at the trench to try and get the notebook, and as I did, an RPG came really close. I mean, the hairs literally lifted, and I then left the notebook. And I often wondered if the Taliban afterwards went through my notes and thought these are the British plans for Helmand.
Is there ever a moment when you say, I'll never come back? This was too close to the bone. Look, I mean, you go to war, you know you're going to have a near-death experience. You go, but you know that theoretically, and then it actually happens. And at least with me, I find that it altered me from the inside in ways that when I came back from the conflict, I was too busy being brave and proving that I could be brave when I was there. So the meltdown, internal meltdown, or the processing of it starts when you come back. And then the disorientation happens because you're surrounded by people who actually don't understand what you just experienced, right? So is there ever that moment when you say, okay, this is too hard, this is a schizophrenic existence, I can't explain it when I come back, I don't want to actually die doing this? Is there ever that moment?
Yeah, I mean, you're absolutely right. When you come back, it can be really difficult to adjust to, caring about things like whether your bathroom needs painting, or, my mum will go on to me about, the trains not running on time, and I'm kind of thinking I've just been in a place where people are being killed as they walk out of their door, and so, but you also have to understand that those things matter to people in that country. And So I think I had a particular year that I just talked about being ambushed in 2006, and we were under fire. We were really lucky to escape with our lives at the end of that. In that same year, I was in a hotel in Pakistan that was suicide bombed. And I was also on Benazir Bhutto's bus when it was blown up. So that was all within a year. So I did start to think that my luck was running out and maybe I shouldn't be doing this anymore. But interestingly, the night I got back from Pakistan, having been on Benazir's bus, I went out for dinner with a group of lawyers in London who were hosting a very brave Brazilian human rights lawyer called Beatriz Matetwa. And she'd risked her life the whole time trying to take on the Mugabe regime. So at the dinner, and I knew her quite well, I said to her, I don't know if there's any point in keep coming to Zimbabwe to report, because I'm putting other people at risk when I interview them, and at the end of the day it doesn't seem to make any difference, and I'm risking my life as well. And she said to me, if people like you don't write about what people like me are doing, what is the point of what we're doing? And that really sort of made me think, and I felt, it's important.
It's like being the bridge between circumstances that your readers or your viewers may not have access to, telling that story and being that bridge in a way. But I want to ask you something, that in the age of Trump and in the age of populist nationalism, and I think there's a lot of that here as well, is a dilemma for somebody who covers conflict and insurgencies. Do you think, as a reporter, without nationality, or does your nationality and your citizenship impact A, how you see a story, B, how you see the conflict, and C, what you will tell and what you won't tell?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I mean, I think we all like to think that we're objective as journalists and that we're, just reporting what we see. But of course, what you see depends on the lens that you're seeing it with, which really does depend where you're from and what your background. So I think that does make a difference. I mean, I consider myself to be a storyteller, and I feel like what I'm doing is trying to give voice to people and not putting my opinion. But, you're making a choice of whose story to tell and how to tell it. So I think that does make a difference. And of course, in recent years, since 9/11, I'm from a country which is involved in a lot of the wars that I've been covering. So that also is a situation that I had not been in before, and I think makes a difference, particularly, for example, with Iraq, where you don't agree with the war. And you asked me about, if I ever considered it too dangerous to stop. I think it's not so much the danger that bothers me, it's the frustration that it doesn't make a difference. So I have reported on the war in Afghanistan, the war in Iraq, on Libya, I've gone to Syria, and I just see the same mistakes being made over and over again. And you feel like, we keep writing about these mistakes, and yet the same thing keeps happening, and even with Mosul now. Because what I'm meaning to say is, I think it's quite easy for Western military to topple a dictator or oust a terrorist group from power in a place, because we have overwhelming military might and air power. But the big problem is what you do afterwards, how you administer the place, the political setup. So, I think in Mosul we're seeing the same thing again now.
But let me push you a bit on I mean, I agree with you that I think how we see something is subconsciously or consciously impacted by how our mind has been molded, and our mind has been molded by many variables, including our nationality and our nationalism. But we have a very, very fierce debate right now. It's become political, it extends to the media. who's nationalist and who's anti-national. And I can personally share with you that I, who consider myself extremely sentimental about the military, I cut my teeth as a reporter, embedded, informally embedded, because we don't have the notion of embedded journalism, but seeing the Indian Army fight very closely against Pakistan and Kargil. But I also have a reasonably complex reportage on Kashmir, for which I am repeatedly called anti-national. And I'm just wondering if in your space you deal with labels like that. Do you face pushback from institutions that believe you were too soft or too hawkish or one or the other? And how do you deal with that pushback?
So, I think in a way one of the signs of a kind of well-established democracy is that people don't see that, okay? And so I've written very critically of my country's involvement in these wars that I just mentioned, and that's not a problem. I don't get people saying I'm being anti-nationalist. There's a big debate all the time, should we have done this? I think overwhelmingly in the UK, people feel that getting involved in Iraq was a bad decision. And so that's not an issue. But interestingly, that's changing a bit in the UK. And with Brexit, which has exposed big divisions that maybe we didn't realise we had or pretended we didn't have. And so we have had government minister recently, Andrea Leadsom, say to BBC presenter Emily Maitlis when she was questioning her about the chaos in the Brexit negotiations, her saying, well, I think you're being unpatriotic. She's like, no, she's doing her job as a journalist, asking questions.
So that is, I think, it's a global phenomenon to that extent. Now, I want to speak to you a little bit about being a woman at the front. And to share a personal story with the audience here, a lot of people here think I was the first woman to go and cover a war, but actually it was my mother 3 decades earlier in 1965. She was a reporter with the Hindustan Times, and she actually got that job with great difficulty because initially they didn't even have women in the newsroom. And then she wanted to go and cover the India-Pakistan war, and the editor said absolutely not. So she went alone. It was an age before television, with her notepad and pen, and she started sending dispatches that were too good to not publish. But in 1999, when I wanted to go and cover a war, there was initially huge pushback at having a woman at the front. And some of the reasons that were given to me were, we don't have separate bathrooms, or we don't have a place for you to sleep. It's an all-male space. And of course, I fought my way through, and I said, I don't need a loo, and I'll go, behind the tree or under, behind a rock, just like everybody else. But it was a fight. It was a fight, and it was a fight that made me so defensive when I was there that I must never do something or say something that people will say we won't send women to the front again. I must never be a problem. I must never show weakness. And I'm just, I'm calmer and more comfortable in my own skin. I was in my 20s then, but I'm just wondering whether there was that process for you. Is it different being female at the front?
Yeah. Well, the first war that I covered was Afghanistan when the Russians were there in the late 80s. And interestingly, particularly given Afghanistan's culture, there was no issue really about foreign women traveling with the Mujahideen. And afterwards, I thought about it. At the time, I didn't think so much, but afterwards, it was almost like they considered foreign women reporters as some kind of third sex. And there was one of the resistance groups, Abdul Haq, the Kabul commander. I used to speak to him a lot, and I wanted to go to Kabul with his fighters, which was a difficult trip. And he said to me, girls don't go to war. And he insisted that I went on one of their training camps. And so I did feel I had to really prove myself that I was not, I was stronger. Interestingly, I seemed to be a better shot than most of the Afghan Mujahideen. So after that, he let me go. But I do think that women and men report war very differently. And I think that we are much more interested in sort of the people behind the lines and how
More
they
than the
live.
guns, it's the soldiers. I mean, I felt that at least, yeah.
But not just the soldiers, also the people
stories
living
and the
there.
victims, yeah.
And, you know, how, because, you know, you look at Syria and all of what's going on there, but there's still 12 million people living in their homes, getting on with day-to-day life. And I went to a wedding there last year. So, it's sort of what you see on TV or read in papers about countries at war is usually the sort of extreme, but there's an awful lot of people trying to carry on daily life and educate and feed and shelter their children, and those people are generally women, and that to me is the most interesting story. I'm not very interested in the bang bang, actually.
But you know, you make this interesting comment that the way men and women report war is different, and I would agree, though I'm intuitively a little uncomfortable with nurture nature, and that's a whole different debate. But I do feel that women who cover war or do roles that are high profile, and covering war is high profile, it puts you in the public gaze in a direct sort of way, do get deconstructed, at least here in my country, in a way that men don't. You know, I was 26, 27 years old when I covered a war for the first time. And we were totally cut off. This was before the age of, in our country, we didn't have mobile phones when this war happened. We didn't have broadcast vans. So I was cut off from what people were saying or what people thought about what I'd done. But I came back to overwhelming accolades and overwhelming scrutiny and criticism, and everybody had an opinion of you, right? And I felt that part of it was my being female, that everybody has an opinion of me till this date, not just because of who I am, but what my gender is. And I'm not playing victim because there's nothing victim-y about my personality, but I'm just asking you if you feel women are evaluated in a different sort of way.
Yeah, of course. But the most criticism I've faced has been from other women, I'm sorry to say.
Women are not exempt from misogyny or patriarchy.
And, you know, a lot of it is about being a mother and how can you go to war when you have a child and you're being selfish and you should be looking after your child.
People have said that to you?
Yeah, written it. And
women have said to you,
yes, quite.
You're a selfish mom because you're a parent and you go and cover war. Yeah. Do they say that to your husband?
No. Well, he doesn't cover war.
Well, he doesn't cover war.
But they don't say it to male war
correspondents. Do they say it to male war correspondents?
No. So, and I mean, interestingly, one of the women that criticized me in a sister newspaper ended up having a child herself and going to war. So that was very hypocritical.
But you know, I did read a profile of you where actually there was a woman writing it, and she was writing it in an empathetic sort of way. But I still felt it was very subliminally sexist, because it was all about how if a woman is a mother, there's a problem, there's a different set of problems with her covering conflict. And I'm just saying, the moment we sort of say that, haven't we accepted that there's more pressure on us and that we will be confronted with these set of questions that our male counterparts will not? Like, I mean, till this date, I have people interview me saying, oh, are you married, are you not? And I always turn around and say, I'm not going to answer that, because you wouldn't ask a male colleague of mine that question.
Yeah, I certainly feel that we're under more scrutiny, and in all things, I believe that women still have to show that they're better at the job than a man in order to get promoted. I mean, I don't know if you've followed, we've got this huge debate going on in the UK at the moment because the BBC has had to publish the salaries of their highest paid earners, anybody earning more than £150,000, and it's overwhelmingly men.
The gap in what men and women are being paid. Yeah.
So now there's a lot of discussion. Why is it because women are not so good at asking for pay rises and expect that if they do a job well, that they should be rewarded, whereas the men are sort of going to the pub together and
it's exactly the
discussing
same
it.
here. It's exactly the same here.
But I would also say, so, you know, I've been a journalist for 30 years now. I have never had a female editor. I've never had a female foreign editor. I've never had a female news editor or a female editor of paper. I've worked for several papers, which I think is shocking. I mean, when I started out, if someone had said to me that you might retire never having had a female boss, I would have thought they were completely mad. But so it seems to me, you know, progress for women has not been as much as I would have thought it would be. The other thing that I've found a lot recently, because I think that there are a lot of advantages being a female journalist, and I think we're better at listening to people, and I think people find women easier to talk to, and also because I spend a lot of time in the Middle East, I can go and speak to all the women where my male colleagues can't. So I think we are in a much better position to report from there. But in the last couple of years, I've found myself reporting on more brutality against women than I ever have before, whether it's the Yazidi women being raped by ISIS in northern Iraq, women in northeastern Nigeria being raped by Boko Haram. I mean, most horrific stories that I've ever covered, and that really shocks me, that it feels like there's more violence and more systematic violence against women than there was when I started out in this job.
I want to talk a little bit about a space that you have covered extensively, starting with that fortuitous invitation card to Benazir's wedding, which is Pakistan. Now, it's quite interesting, a lot of the Indian reaction to the resignation of Nawaz Sharif has seen it as an open and shut corruption case in the Panama Papers, and I've seen a lot of Indians commenting on social media saying, look at how accountable, they're one step ahead of us in accountability, we haven't even started with our investigations here. My argument as someone who covers Pakistan quite a bit would be that there's a structural drama here between the military and Nawaz Sharif, and I would go so far as to argue that this might even be a judicial coup. Is that how you see it, or do you see this as a democratic principle being upheld?
Yeah, well, I mean, first of all, you can look at it and think that actually this is a great victory of accountability, and, you know, a prime minister facing sort of ultimate accountability here. And so it looks positive. But at the same time, then you look at Pakistan's history, the fact that no prime minister ever finishes their term. They're always stopped. Usually it's the military taking over, and almost always they're accused of corruption. I feel very strongly that what Pakistan needs is for people to be voting these elected leaders out, not the military or the courts or whatever. I think it's good that the courts hold people to account. But, you know, it looks vindictive because it was only Nawaz Sharif and his family that were held to account when there were plenty of other names appeared in the Panama Papers. Mm-hmm. And I just wonder what's going to happen next. I do feel with Pakistan, I first went there in 87. I wrote a book that came out in 1990, Waiting for Allah. And that book almost reads as though it could be today, because it's the same people still running the country. It was Nawaz Sharif then, the Bhuttos. It's, you know, if this decision leads to an end of this dynastic politics in Pakistan, then that would be a good thing. And also, you know, another thing about Pakistan, I don't know any other country that is the same way. Every leading politician in Pakistan has a house in London, and their family are mostly in London. And, you know,
including Musharraf, who is
Yes.
today, as a military dictator, lecturing Pakistan on upholding democratic values.
Yeah, I mean, the hypocrisy of that is, and this is the problem. I mean, actually, the basis on which the court disqualified Nawaz Sharif wasn't exactly all this corruption. It was under this kind of vague constitutional clause brought in by General Zia, under which politicians are supposed to act in an honest and reliable way. And, you know, as somebody said, if that clause was really enforced, none of the politicians in Pakistan would be able to run. So, I think there's a danger of this looking like victimization. The same that when I first went to Pakistan, it was General Zia, Benazir then took over. She was kicked out for corruption. And then Nawaz Sharif took over, then he was kicked out for corruption, and then she came back. You know, and you had this.
Well, there's a new player in the mix relatively, which is Imran Khan.
Yeah. So, well, this
and he's the biggest gainer right now from
this is a great victory for Imran Khan, because he's the one that's been banging on about corruption and about the Panama Papers, and so this looks like a victory for him and what he's saying. I have other issues with Imran Khan. I have no reason to think that he's corrupt at all. I don't think that.
What are your issues with
him? He's incredibly hypocritical. When I first was going to Pakistan, he was a well-known fixture in the nightclubs of London. And now he portrays himself as an Islamist. He's written a book, an autobiography, where he writes about how shocked he was going to London for the first time and going to study in Oxford and seeing the way people behaved. He was part of that. So, none of these people, unfortunately, are completely clean. To me, the biggest tragedy of Pakistan is its politicians. Pakistan is full of amazing people, full of amazing women, but the people running the country have, in general, not been amazing.
How would you describe? Who do you think is the most promising, authentic political leader out of Pakistan?
I don't know, because actually, younger generation are not going into politics in Pakistan, and who can blame them? Why would you want to go into that system? And Pakistan still needs to sort a lot of other things out. It's still a very feudal country. It's still the same families that really run the country. So I can go back 30 years after I first went there and still know the people that were running things from that time. And that's not right. After 30 years, you should have a different group of people in power. You should have different generations. And it's handy for me as a journalist, because I still have all the contacts, but it's not good for the country.
So I don't know how we're doing on time. I think we have about 5-7 minutes left. So Afghanistan, which has really been your primary, in a sense, reporting beat, if I could call it that. Do you believe that the Americans, in particular, under Donald Trump, will change their approach to Afghanistan?
Well, I think we're still waiting for the tweet from Donald Trump on that.
And who he might sack next, right?
Yes, yeah. As people say, it's like an episode of The Apprentice, isn't it, every day? I have no idea, really. I don't think anybody does what he's going to do about Afghanistan. It looked like he was going to send more troops. Then he suddenly had this meeting with Eric Prince from Blackwater about using mercenaries to fight. The fact is, in Afghanistan, the answer isn't anyway sending 4,000 or 5,000 more troops. At the moment, there's 13,000 NATO troops. At one point, there were 140,000 in Afghanistan, and they didn't defeat the Taliban. So I can't see that sending 5,000 is going to make any difference. What would make a difference is doing something about Pakistan's support for the Taliban, because there's no doubt that the fact that the Taliban had this safe haven in Pakistan, could get medical treatment, were getting funding, training, whatever, made it very difficult to defeat. When I was Helmand in southern Afghanistan with the British troops, it seemed a ridiculous situation. They were fighting Taliban, but doing nothing about over the border where more and more people were coming from. There was a sort of endless supply. So what was the point of fighting people? And again, you know, is military force the answer, or is it because people feel that the government of Afghanistan is not actually providing for them, that corruption is a huge issue there? Studies show that the average Afghan is spending 2 months of their 12-month salary on bribes. You can't get anything done, any legal case or anything, without bribing people. The police keep asking people for money. So it's too easy for Taliban to come into places and say, you know, we're going to impose law and order and get rid of all of this. And people think, well, actually, you know, this is a better idea. And so that, to me, is what needs to be tackled, that and the overseas support. But unfortunately, Afghanistan's getting a whole lot more complicated, because now you've got Russia arming some of the Taliban, you've got the Iranians. You know, Afghanistan's problem, in a way, is its location. You know, its borders with China, Russia, Iran, Pakistan, all these places that are trying to interfere. And I was last there 3 months ago in April, and was really shocked at how the situation had deteriorated, and more people are being killed now than any time of the 16-year war, which is very sad.
Yeah. I'm told we have time to take 2 or 3 questions from the floor, but before I open it up, what has been your single most frightening moment as a journalist?
I mean, probably the single most dangerous thing I was in was being on Benazir's bus when it was blown up. But that wasn't really frightening, because it happened very quickly. It was a bomb, and then I'd survived. So it wasn't like there was a long period of thinking that you were going to die. The time I was ambushed in Helmand, I think, was I couldn't see how we could get out of that, because we were completely surrounded on all sides, and also the British soldiers I was with clearly thought that we were going to die. And in fact, at one point, the sergeant major asked me if I could use a pistol, because he said we're going to get pinned down in all of these ditches and we're going to have to fight for our lives.
And can you use a pistol? Is that part of training?
No, I've never trained. I mean, funnily, at university, I did used to go without ever thinking. Like I told you, I'd never thought about being a war correspondent. I did used to go to pistol shooting, because I quite liked at fun fairs in England doing the shooting and trying to win things.
Life takes you to strange, unexpected places. We have time for about 3 questions. And I'm seeing many more than 3 hands. I'm seeing a young girl at the second table. Please stand up. Second table, yes. Do you have a mic? Yeah, it's coming, yeah. Yeah.
Afternoon, it's nice to see you all. One of my questions here was, as war correspondents, or former war correspondents, do you feel that as a population, people around the globe have reached a certain saturation point when it comes to looking at war news? Because there's such a massive input of visuals which you see every day, and they have so much impact that most people are like, okay, we have our own lives to go ahead with. It's getting tiring. Because I was born out in the Middle East, and I saw a lot of news person here growing up, and a lot of my friends beyond a certain point were like, it happens every day when you heard. So do you feel that there is something that we can do to resolve this, or is it an interpretation problem?
I mean, I think it's a great question, because it's a huge challenge for journalism. Because after you have seen, Yemen and those horrific pictures of children starving, and Syria and Aleppo and the baby being washed ashore. But there is a point to what she's saying, that when every day the headline is the same, how do you get people to care?
No, I think it is a problem. There's too much war going on. There's more war going on in the Middle East than any time in my lifetime, and in a more complicated ways too. So, like, you know, we're on the same side in some countries as, like, you know, same side as Iran, for example, in Iraq, defeating ISIS, but then on the other side in Syria. So, you know, it's very confusing too to explain to people. It's not black and white. These wars don't end. You know, Afghanistan's still going on, Iraq's still going on, Libya's still going on. So people get fed up. You know, Afghanistan is my passion, but I find it really difficult to get my newspaper to send me there because, you know, my editor frankly says that's yesterday's war. And I'm like, well, it's not, because more people are dying now. And we do still have British troops there, and we lost more people there and spent more money than any other war in recent decades. So people want to know, was it worth it? We should be covering it. But the fact is, you know, with all the cutbacks in media, we've all got fewer correspondents. My paper, the Sunday Times, there used to be 4 of us in London going out covering things. Now it's just me. There's more things happening. It's become more dangerous. There are parts of the world that are, you know, too dangerous for us to report on, which is not something I ever imagined saying a few years ago. So things are not getting reported. We've not reported on Yemen, really, on my paper. Not because we don't think it matters, but it's hard if you're prioritizing scarce resources. And I also think your question, that it's a challenge to us too, to find ways of reporting things that still engage people when these things have been going on for a very long time.
Okay, anyone else? Let me give someone else a chance. Behind you, yes, please, yeah. In the blue shirt, as far as I can see, yes.
Thank you, ma'am. Good afternoon. I think both of you could answer this question, as both of you would bring in new perspectives. Because, you know, journalism, as they say, is the calling of the idealists. But what happens to your sense of idealism once you are out there on the battlefield? How does it affect your relationship with A, violence, B, what they call mark-politik or real politik? What happens to an idealistic person who is averse to violence when that person is on the battlefield? How does it change you as a human being?
Well, it's, I mean, let me try and say what the biggest challenge is, and then I'll hand it over to Christina. I mean, there was a point in reporting from Kashmir that I had lost count of the number of bodies that I had seen. And my ritual had become that I would be in the hotel and I would either get a phone call and say so-and-so's been assassinated, a bomb has gone off here, a bomb has gone off there. And I would literally at times be running out in my pajamas and t-shirt, not even having time to, you know, get on a pair of jeans. And I think for me the challenge was that I've seen so much of this that I must never stop feeling that this is actually death and violence, that there's that danger of numbing, and yet you can't get sentimental because you have to tell the story. So where is that space where you're still an empathetic feeling person, but where that feeling doesn't overwhelm you and obstruct you from telling the story?
Yeah, I agree. I think it's easy to become jaded after a while, to sort of think, well, these people are in a bad situation, but actually it's nothing compared to what I've seen in Iraq or somewhere. But I think you don't lose your ideological feeling, because most journalists, I think, covering these kind of things, you want to make a difference. You want to tell this story because you want people to know and you want it to stop. I don't think the war is a solution to anything. And so I would like people outside to know. But I also, I mean, I've found that I'm still shocked by things. So last year I went to Aleppo. I have never seen so much destruction in my life. And okay, I'd seen pictures of it on TV before, but when you actually go there and you walk in the streets in the old city, and it's mile after mile of nothing but rubble of what was once a great city, You know, I've just never seen anything like that. Similarly, as I mentioned, the stories of some of the women and the things that have happened to them in recent years is more shocking than anything I've heard before. So, you know, it would be nice if the world was a place where you weren't still shocked, but I think we need to stay shocked about things.
Okay, anybody else? Yeah, left side, someone's waving out. I can't see you properly. If you stand up, it'll help me. Last question, yeah. Okay, I can't see you. Where are you? Okay.
What are difficulties faced by independent journalists in the war area as compared to embedded journalists?
What's the difficulty between being embedded and not embedded? Well, I mean, I actually think like Kargil, for example, was not embedded because India doesn't have a notion of an embedded reportage, but you were still within the confines and the diktats of what the military let you do. So even if they weren't kind of taking you into battle and allowing you to travel up into a certain point, you can't really be a sort of, you know, you can't really go solo in a war zone, can you?
Well, not now. So I think, you know, like when I started out with the Mujahideen, I suppose in a way I was embedded with the Mujahideen. We just didn't think about it in that terms. But when the war in Iraq started, we had a big meeting at the Sunday Times about how we were going to cover it. And I and some of my colleagues were really against being embedded because we thought that that would really compromise us, and we wanted to be independent, covering both sides. But actually, what I realized was when the war started that the people getting the best stuff early on were embedded people because they were kind of getting up front. And actually, I was what they called a unilateral, which meant I was sort of driving around in a car in between the fighting, not really knowing what was going on some of the time, and sometimes getting in front of the front line. So it was actually really dangerous. And the other thing was, Iraq having been a dictatorship for so many years, people there didn't really have any notion of a free press. So to them, we were no different than the military. We might as well have been embedded. But I do have an issue, you know, when you're embedded, you know, you're not completely free because you're dependent on the people you're with for survival. You often befriend them, and you know, if you see them doing something bad, do you then report it? It all becomes quite complicated. So, but it is part of the story, and as Barkha said, you know, sometimes you can't get to these places now without being embedded.
Well, there's lots to talk about, but I'm out of time. I will only say more power to your pen, and here's to the next story. It's been a pleasure talking to you. Let's have a big round of applause for Christina Lamb.
Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Barkha ma'am, and thank you so much, Christina.